Hello, welcome to the Loquitur Media, and today we are here with a special guest, a columnist for the Philadelphia Sports Inquirer. He's also written 3 books, most recently a biography about Kobe Bryant. Mike Sielski. Mike, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks
I'm
for having me, guys.
co-host Chris Schaller.
And I'm Price Jameson, and once again, it's an honor, for you to take the time to come and chop it up with us. Obviously, this is something, that Loquitur Media hasn't done yet, so I'm excited and fun, and I'm just hop right on into it, and get into asking you to relate to your environment for a second, and, sort of dive into how it was when you were in our shoes, how it was as a college student, what things did you dive into before you were in the world of comm?
Well, based on this, it's not so different from what I experienced in the mid-1990s as a college student at LaSalle University, not too far from here. We had a student newspaper, we had a student TV station, we had the university had just built and opened its new communication center. It's not new anymore, it was 26 years ago now, but very similar to this kind of setup. And I was writing for the student newspaper, I was working on the student TV station, just as you guys are in this way, hosting shows, mostly about the men's basketball team at the school. And I would say the biggest difference is back then there was a much more kind of defined pathway into the profession than there is now. Back then, if you were a college student, you wanted to get an internship at your local newspaper or your local radio station or a bigger radio station or bigger newspaper if you could, and kind of work your way up from there. And that was really the only sort of pathway that you had. Now, obviously, with the advent of the internet and social media and all these things, and I talk about the advent of the internet as if it just happened. Of course, it's been around forever now. There are so many different ways. There's no one way to become a media figure or to practice journalism or do any of the things that you guys are learning in your classes here at Cabrini. So in that way, it's different. This, not so different. A year from now, 2 years from now, when you guys are out of here and pursuing your careers, that'll be a little bit different.
Yeah. And then,
at what point during your time as, say, in LaSalle or wherever during your career, at what point did you realize that sports writing was your calling? Like, when did you?
Well, when I started in college, I knew I wanted to be involved in sports media in some respect. I just didn't know what respect that was going to be. Did I want to be a writer? Did I want to be on TV? Did I want to try to be a play-by-play voice? Something like that. I just knew I wanted to sports media to be my thing in my career. So when I got to LaSalle, I started writing for the student paper right away as a freshman. And my sophomore year, I was covering the women's basketball team at LaSalle, and I had a number of friends who were on the team. We were in the same dormitory together. And I ended up covering a game for that team against Notre Dame at a time when Notre Dame was really good, and LaSalle beat them. And I was there to watch this game, and it was really cool. It was really exciting. I was happy for my friends, and I thought, I want to try to write this story for the student paper in the same way that I approach all my assignments for my classes. I was a very diligent student. I always poured all of myself into my work. But I hadn't really done that for the student paper. And so I wanted to try to do this, to take that approach to this article. And I did. I really worked harder on it than I had anything previously for the student paper. And the article got a really good reaction. I was really happy with how it turned out. And that feedback was really enticing and rewarding. And it made me feel like, oh, okay, this is cool. Like, I liked putting the time in and taking the care to write something that people were giving me good feedback about, and that was it. I was hooked. I knew I wanted to be a sports writer. I started reading the Inquirer and the Daily News more closely for how writers wrote their stories. I started expanding the kind of things I would read, thinking that, okay, well, I can learn something from how the job is done from reading these people, and that was it. I knew what I wanted to do.
Yeah, so, it really seemed like you really had that, writing for newspaper motivation even before college. It seems like, I don't know if you, wrote probably for a high school paper or and then
I did, yeah.
You did say that, obviously you went to Upper Dublin, which is a rival of mine.
I did go to Upper Dublin High School.
At that time, so That's really cool. And then in particular, you know, as he said with the sports writing, how was really sports comm really emphasized in the school setting? Because at least here, in terms of that program, it's fairly young. You know, so, you know, how really was it back at that time, if it was emphasized at all, to really be play-by-play or things of that nature?
Well, it was emphasized in two ways. One was through the student newspaper, which you could cover the men's and women's basketball teams basically right away. I mean, LaSalle is similar to Cabrini. It's a pretty small school, but it had a Division I basketball team with a great tradition at the time. And I was aware of that tradition. My dad had gone to LaSalle. His brother had gone to LaSalle. My mom's brother had gone to LaSalle. I grew up kind of steeped in the history of LaSalle basketball. And so when I got to the school, I really wanted to cover men's and women's basketball for the student paper. It didn't take long for me to realize, like, that's what I wanted to do. And so I could go to the games myself and sit press row and talk to the players and travel with them. My senior year, I was traveling with them to Berkeley, California and Iowa for road trips to cover the team. So there was that aspect of it. You could kind of jump in right away, and if you had initiative, you could work your way up the student paper to get to that point. The other aspect of it was within the communication department, they had cameras and they had a local channel on Comcast within the city where you could do a show about men's basketball and you could interview the coach and players or talk about it in the way that kind of we're talking just now. So, you know, you had these avenues that if you had the desire to pursue them, you could. And the great thing about LaSalle, and I'm sure it's very similar here, is that if you show that initiative, there are faculty members and staff members who are willing to help you and to kind of set you on that path. Oh, okay, you want to do this? Go do it. Here's how it's done. Go grab a camera, go grab a notepad and a pen, you know, go post this digitally and let's go. And that was great.
Yeah, you mentioned how you said posting digitally, and during these times, I mean, it's a large portion of what journalism is through social media.
Sure.
How has that? How have you had to adjust over time to sports writing, going from a typewriter, going to a computer, now going to an app? How has that advanced over time?
Well, I mean, you get feedback immediately, and often that feedback is harsher, whether it's on Twitter or Facebook or a faster email, because it's easier for people to react in the moment to what you're writing, right? Like, used to be, you know, back when I was in college in the mid-1990s, if I had been a sports writer for the Inquirer, let's say at that time, and I write a column about the Eagles game last night, nobody would see it until the next day. So they would have had time to process the loss, and if they were a really fervid Eagles fan who was really angry about the loss and really angry about something that I had written, at least they had had time to, like, take a step back and process everything, right? Doesn't happen now. You know, I post a column on Twitter, and immediately I get people telling me I'm an idiot, no matter what I've written. And that's fine. That comes with the territory. I'm in the kind of job where I dish it out, so I have to be able to take it in return. But it does change a little bit the sense of what you're writing and why you're writing, because you know through analytics, through reaction on social media, you know what people want to read. And you can play to that a lot if you want to. And it's a challenge sometimes, I find, and I think for a lot of writers, to kind of maintain a measure of perspective and integrity in writing about what you're going to write about, because it's very easy to get caught up in, let me have a hot take or a really strong opinion because I know there will be reaction and I know people will click on it and give me feedback back and call me an idiot or say I'm brilliant or whatever the case may be. And your job, first and foremost, as a journalist and a writer and a columnist, is to reflect reality. And reality's murky. There aren't always clear-cut heroes and villains, whether it's in sports, real life, politics, any of that stuff. So I feel like I have a responsibility to say, okay, look, I may have a strong opinion about this, but I'm going to try to deliver it in as measured a way as I possibly can. There are only so many topics or issues that are going to cause me to shake my fist and scream, so to speak, in print, because you can only do that so much. We can only, you know, after a while, if you listen to Skip Bayless or Stephen A. Smith or people who are on these 24-hour political channels screaming about everything, it totally loses its effect because you're screaming about everything. How am I supposed to know what's really important and what's not really important? So I work really hard to try to maintain that measure of kind of evenness and fairness, so that people know how to react to what I'm writing.
Right, because it becomes more of like an entertainment aspect at that point.
Yeah.
I completely understand, and over time, because like 10 years ago, for like you wanted like reactions to sports-wise, you turn into WIP, listen to the afternoon show, morning show. Now it's with social media, you can tweet something out and people respond to you. So
yeah, and that's the thing, right? With social media, anybody can have a reaction, and anybody can have an opinion. So what makes my opinion more valid or better than somebody else's who's just writing on a blog or posting on Twitter or Facebook or social media or something like that? Mm-hmm. So that's where the actual journalism comes into play. You have to be able to talk to people to find out what's really going on. You have to be able to do your research, make sure everything you're writing is accurate. It's anybody can say Jalen Hurts is a great quarterback or Jalen Hurts is a terrible quarterback. Mm-hmm. It's incumbent upon someone like me to say, okay, if I'm going to say he's a terrible quarterback, I better be able to give an explanation as to why, and it better make sense, and it better be smart.
Yeah.
And it's funny because I feel like, this actually segues right into something that you wanted to touch on about a incident.
I feel like with your reputation, I feel like this has to be mentioned. About a year ago.
Come at me, bro.
About a year ago, you kind of came in a crossfire, I'd say, with at that point Flyers forward Jakub Voracek, and he kind of pushed back on you. How do you deal with that? Like, how do you not get discombobulated? How do you not get how do you not zone out from a situation like that?
Well, number one, I keep in mind that it's not personal, right? I don't think it is anyway. He's angry with something I've written, or he's angry with something I've said on Twitter, misinterpreted a joke, maybe something like that. So for me, it's not personal. I'm not criticizing any athlete or any coach or any executive for any team from the standpoint of like, I don't like that person. Mm-hmm. I'm coming at it from, I think he or she could do his or her job better, or isn't doing a good job, and here's why I think that. Mm-hmm. That's one thing. The second thing is, as I said earlier, I'm in a job where I dish it out. I have to be able to take it in return. And athletes are human beings, and they're allowed to have opinions about what I'm writing and what I have to say, and that's okay. I don't zone out when I'm criticized in return, because that's the nature of the business. That's the nature of the beast. If you can't take that in return, you shouldn't have the job. And so when Jake, came at me in that, in that Zoom call after a game, I mean, I couldn't come back at him, number one, because my call had been cut off. I wasn't in the room with him, so there was no way for me to return fire, so to speak. But even if I had been there, I would have been like, okay, hold on a minute. Let's talk about why you're so angry with me. Right, yeah. One of the things we talked earlier about social media, one of the things that it does, and certainly it did this during the pandemic, because the pandemic created that wall between the athlete and the coach and the media who cover the teams. It became much easier for people in my position to see these athletes and coaches not as real flesh and blood human beings, but as kind of just people on a screen. And it's a whole lot easier to be hard on people on a screen who you don't have to interact with one-on-one and in person.
Exactly.
So, it would have been easy for somebody in my position to just criticize or rip athletes and coaches, because, well, what are they going to do? They're going to yell at me on the screen? Well, one of them did.
Crazy.
And so I've got to be able to take it.
You have to take back what you
say. I mean, that's part of
your job to analyze that.
Right, and it's not my job to be a Flyers fan. I'm not rooting for any of these teams to win. And I think, again, to come back to social media and the rise of the internet, that's something that has changed, I think, the perspective of a lot of consumers of information and readers and fans, is that there is an expectation that somebody who covers a team is rooting for that team or wants that team to win. That's always kind of been there in the ether of covering sports, but it's particularly acute now because there are so many websites that are devoted to fans of a particular team that are maintained and operated by fans of that particular team.
Exactly.
SB Nation.
Yeah, things like that. SB Nation, or InsideTheEagles.com or something like that. And the teams themselves have their own websites where they are not going to put out information that makes them look bad. You know, Dave Spadaro has a very essential job for the Eagles. He is in charge of the content on their website for the most part.
Yeah.
He's not going to put anything out there that, generally speaking, makes Nick Sirianni or Jalen Hurts or Jonathan Gannon look bad.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean. But that doesn't mean that that's everything that's going on with the team. Fans have eyes to see. We have mouths to ask questions and brains to process what we're seeing, and that's our job. It's not to present things the way we all hope they would
Exactly.
be. It's to present it as they are and to say things as they are.
Tell it how it is. You don't have to like cater to anyone's certain needs.
Exactly.
Whatnot. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, you know, sports columnist here, but you know, before getting to that level, obviously you had your fair share of experience in a lot of different sceneries. You know, obviously, to dating back to when you even worked for some local Bucks County papers and whatnot. At one point, even joined the Wall Street
Journal. Yeah.
You know, probably back in like 2010, I believe.
Yeah, I came up working for the most of my time early in my career. I was working for the Intelligencer, which is based in Central Bucks County and covers most of Bucks County. And so I started out right out of college and grad school, giving up my Friday nights. I wasn't going to hang out with my friends or try to find a girlfriend or something like that. I was covering high school football games on Friday nights. Yeah. So I did that for a long while. I was able to kind of work my way up. And then in 2010, I went and worked at the Wall Street Journal. They created a New York section to their paper and to their website. They wanted to cover that area in all its aspects, including sports. So I spent 3.5 years there, which was an interesting experience because most people don't read the Wall Street Journal first and foremost for its sports coverage. So that was an interesting experience to understand like what the readership of the journal was and how to write and cover sports in a way that would attract those readers and inform them. And then from there I came back to Philadelphia, which obviously, as we all know, is a very, very enthusiastic sports town. It's in the DNA of the city and its suburban areas and the areas around it. So that was a bit of a, getting reacclimated to what it was like to write for Philadelphia sports fans. But that's what you want in an audience. You want an audience that's informed and passionate, and that's what the Philadelphia market brings.
Yeah. So was that really, was that passion around the city and sports really what brought you back? Was it because you're a local guy? I'm guessing all those things, it just...
That was a big part of it. The job at the Inquirer also paid me more money than the one at the Wall Street Journal, which when you have a wife and, one kid at the time and another one on the way, that's something you have to take into consideration. But no, I grew up a big Philly sports fan. I know Philadelphia sports. I know the history. And I think in an area like this, that's vitally important. The area is so parochial and so provincial that there are certain things, events, names, figures that you have to know or at least be familiar with if you're going to cover Philadelphia sports, because people here know those names. Exactly. You have to know what you're talking about. And there's certain kind of, I would call them like totems that you have to know so that you can prove that you know Philadelphia sports. And so I already had that knowledge, and I had done the job. I had just done it at a smaller paper. So to come back to the Inquirer made all the sense in the world. Yeah,
and you're also going from a newspaper prior to being at Philadelphia Inquirer, Wall Street Journal, more stock-oriented, more about news. Then you're going to the Philadelphia Inquirer, which I would say altogether, if you ask someone about the Philadelphia Inquirer, they'll usually bring up sports.
Yeah.
That's usually the first thing that comes to mind.
Yeah.
About it, so.
No, you're 100% right, Chris. I'll give you an example. Okay, so while I was at the Wall Street Journal, Tim Tebow was a backup quarterback for the New York Jets. So I was covering the Jets, I was covering Tim, and the Jets like to run. When Tebow would come in the game, they would run him in what was called the Wildcat formation. Okay, now if you're a football fan, you know what a Wildcat formation is. Yeah. Okay, it means that you snap the ball directly to a guy who may or may not throw it. He's probably going to run with it, something like that. And the regular quarterback stands out to the side. Well, the Wall Street Journal, we kind of presumed that not all our readers were that in tune with football to know what the Wildcat formation is. Yeah. So the story that I ended up doing about Tim Tebow and the Wildcat was I ended up calling a zoologist and talking to him about wildcats and how was there any connection or similarity between the way wildcats lived in the wild and what the Jets were doing with Tim Tebow. And it was funny, it was meant to be funny, but it was the kind of thing where like you're writing that story for an audience that isn't immersed in sports. Right, they don't care, to the degree that most Philadelphia sports fans do. So that was fine, and it was fun to do that, but I was happy to come back to Philadelphia
Yeah,
and not
of
have
course.
to write pieces like that.
Yeah.
And
Comfortable setting.
Yes.
Exactly.
yeah. And to get away from the journalism side, real quick, you're also an accomplished author. As we see here with the Kobe book right here about the Black Mamba and whatnot. A few books that he has available on Amazon. So one about Jackie Robinson that you contributed to.
Yes.
High school rivalry. Football rivalry.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, Fading Echoes was the second one I did. Yeah.
Facts. And then this is, as his most recent book, so I'm gonna just flat out ask, what really drove it home and motivated you to get this story about Kobe out?
Okay, so Kobe Bryant died on January 26, 2020. So as a columnist for the Inquirer, I was writing columns about him. I had known a few people who had known Kobe when he was at Lower Merion High School. In particular, Greg Downer, who was Kobe's head coach at Lower Merion and is still the head coach at Lower Merion. And a friend of Kobe's named Jeremy Treatman, who, if you know anything about the Philly hoops scene, Jeremy is kind of a mover and shaker in that world. He sets up basketball tournaments and arranges games. He's kind of a mogul.
Sunny Hill in a way.
Yeah, kind of like that. Yeah. So I knew those two guys. I had known them for a long time. And as I was writing about Kobe for the Inquirer, I thought, there's a story here that the rest of the world and the rest of the country kind of overlooks when they think about Kobe. Los Angeles, the West Coast, the country as a whole, the world as a whole, they kind of look at him as a Laker first, foremost, always.
Yeah.
He was so young when he joined the Lakers. He was 17. It was like he kind of sprouted, fully formed out of a hill in Los Angeles. Like, boom, here's Kobe Bryant, and he's a Laker at 17.
Exactly.
But he had this amazing story before all that, and it was all based in the Philadelphia area. Going to Lower Merion High School, winning a state championship there as an underdog, living in Italy for 8 years because his father, Joe, played professional basketball over there. So I thought, why not try to tell Kobe's origin story?
Right.
If you've seen the movie Batman Begins, it's all about why Bruce Wayne becomes Batman and how he does it. I wanted to write Batman Begins for the Black Mamba. So out of that came this. This is what's called a galley. This is kind of a rough draft of the book. And the book is called The Rise, Kobe Bryant and the Pursuit of Immortality. And the book is not a full biography of Kobe's life. It is basically a book about his birth, his background, his family's background, and right up till the moment that he enters the NBA, and kind of how he became the man and the athlete that we all know him to be.
Yeah. And then once again, just to make sure.
Thank you, Bryce. I appreciate that.
Everywhere, in the Lower Merion jersey, which just shows
Yes.
a lot. And so Kobe, it's pretty cool because Kobe is my favorite player, especially because...
That's why I wrote the book. I knew he was your favorite.
Yeah, of course.
Obviously. And then, the first ever game that I saw as a young guy, even younger, at least, was the finals in 2010. It was the Celtics versus the Lakers and whatnot. So then, I saw that as I was getting into the sport, and then ever since then, a big fan.
Yeah, that was his last championship.
Yeah, exactly. It was the fifth one. So, but I gotta ask you, is Kobe in your top 5 all time? Is Kobe?
Well, he's my favorite player now after spending, the better part of a year or more writing about him. Top 5 all time. I don't know. Everybody's list changes. I would put Michael Jordan. I would put Wilt Chamberlain. I would put Bill Russell. Kareem, I think Kareem is criminally underrated and doesn't get mentioned as a top 5 player often enough.
Shaq and Magic.
You got Magic, you got Shaq,
Tim Duncan.
Kobe, Duncan, Larry Bird.
Exactly.
LeBron. Did we mention LeBron? So,
for sure.
I don't want to turn this into a
Podcast,
a Fox Sports 1 screen fest here.
Yeah.
But let me put it this way. I think, and I make this point in the book, I think Kobe's story is really interesting in ways that some of those players' stories aren't. In that, here's a kid who, as I said, lived in Italy for most of his childhood before finally at age 14 coming over and living here permanently in the Lower Merion area, not too far from here, right? So what was that like for him? He's a young black kid getting dropped into a pretty posh suburb just outside of Philadelphia. He hasn't had the childhood that all the white kids there have had. He hasn't had the childhood that all the black kids there have had.
Yeah.
How does he find his way? Well, he finds it through basketball. And he finds it in a way that even most great young players don't do it. He is so driven and so committed, and that fascinated me. And the idea that he could take a team that went 4-20 his freshman year and have them win the district and state championship his senior year. How did that happen? And how did he come to decide, like, no, I don't need college. Even though I scored really high on my SATs and I'm a terrific student, I don't need college. I'm a 6 foot 6-inch guard who's skinny as a rope, and I can make the jump from high school to the NBA. How? What made him think that? All of those questions fascinated me, and that's why I wanted to do the book.
What makes the biography so unique is that it goes over, his childhood. Like, a lot of the other biographies will gloss over like certain finite details. Like, for example, people have no idea that when he was being interviewed, his pre-draft process, just being interviewed by Sixers, he said, "No, I'm from Italy. I'm not from Philly." And in order to go to like Los Angeles or another team, those details I find to be very important in a biography versus, how many points per game he scored this game or.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, I wanted to delve into Kobe beyond just a player.
Yeah.
And let's be honest here, like he was not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. There were darker aspects of his life. And to me, you can see his entire tableau of his life in his early years, right up until the moment, as I said, that he jumps to the NBA. It's all right there if you look hard enough.
Is there a book in particular that resonates with you the most? I guess I would expect you to say this because it's newer, but I just know they all probably mean something different to you.
Sure. Well, the first book I did is called How to Be Like Jackie Robinson, and I co-wrote it with Pat Williams, who used to be the general manager of the 76ers and now writes books. Kind of, that's all he does. So he and I collaborated on that book, and that was special to me because it was my first book. It allowed me to get to learn things about Jackie Robinson, this seminal figure in American history, let alone sports history, that I didn't know. So that was a great experience. My second book was called Fading Echoes, and it's about two guys who grew up in Doylestown, where I live now in Bucks County, who were on opposite sides of a high school football rivalry, Central Bucks East and Central Bucks West, and then they went off and served in Iraq during the war. One of them became a Marine, the other one became an Army Ranger, and one of them was killed in action. So I wanted to explore that story. How did these two guys become the kind of guys who were willing to fight and die for their country, coming out of the same small town and high school sports and all of that stuff? So that story was very personal to me because I know the area so well. And Kobe's story was similar in that regard. I was familiar with him, but the idea of diving deep into his life in this area at that stage of his upbringing and his development really, really fascinated me.
Especially as you keep in mind that you probably also have to go and seek out certain sources to put together the story. I guess, is there really a lot of differences when writing in a journalism type style over a creative type writing it?
Well, you have more freedom in a book like this, right? Because I have 100 to 120,000 words to play with, and I can go on and on if I want to. But in terms of getting the information and the material to write the book, it's exactly the same as a journalistic process. You are seeking out sources, whether it is the Lower Merion Historical Society for some of the old documents that they'll have, or the old high school newspapers from Lower Merion, or Kobe's yearbooks, whether it's interviewing people who coached him or knew him or were in English class with him, or his English teacher, or anybody like that. The process is the same, it just takes a lot longer, and you have to work at it for a much lengthier period of time because you have to gather so much more information.
Right, yeah, and that also feeds into being skilled not only in sports writing, but also in other aspects of writing and journalism as well. As you mentioned earlier, you actually, I think, taught a few classes at LaSalle.
I did.
As well. What did you take away from that you ended up applying to, say, where you are now as a sports writer and writing books as well, and writing as a whole? How did that help?
It's always good to get back to the basics in anything you do. And teaching those classes at LaSalle, I taught Journalism 101. It's like, the 5 W's plus H in your lead, and here's what a lead is, and how do you interview people, and all those things. It's always great to go back over that. You see that in any profession, right? Like, you could be a great basketball player. I'm sure Steph Curry will go through 3 or 4 games where he's not shooting the ball well. And I guarantee you what he does when he goes through a stretch like that is go into a gym by himself and start shooting free throws and shooting layups and just work his way back to make sure his footwork is correct. You see it with quarterbacks in the NFL all the time. Like, let's make sure my throwing fundamentals are back to where they need to be. I'm releasing the ball the right way. My footwork is where it needs to be. And the same principle applies in anything you do, whether you're a doctor, a lawyer, a teacher, a journalist. You go back to your fundamentals. And teaching those classes at LaSalle was great for that. It was great to remind me, oh yeah, like, if I'm stuck with writing a column, it's probably because I didn't report it well enough.
Yeah.
And I need to I need to be conscientious about that and conscious of that. So teaching those classes was great in that regard.
Yeah, it's always good to brush up the basic fundamentals that you factor into
That's
your
exactly
job.
right.
Yeah, it's good to go over that again.
Especially because, it's always said for aspiring journalists and writers and whatnot that a lot of times the interviews and sources, they make the story.
Yes.
They fully create the story, and then it's more so you can add your voice at certain points. But it's always good to, brush up on that, because that's what makes journalism, unique in itself.
You're only as good as your reporting is going to be. And even the best writer can only write his or her way around a lack of reporting so much. Now, sometimes you have to do it. I'm in a position as a columnist where sometimes I have to just write because I'm on a tight deadline and I'm not going to be able to do the reporting that I would otherwise be able and want to do. But the reporting is the core of everything. You have to know what's going on and be as familiar with it as possible and be as detailed with it as possible so you can write from a position of authority.
Yeah, absolutely, because it's funny. I want you to go sort of back into how, you only had so much time on a deadline, to get done a column. But in that case,
time crunching,
in that case, your reporting or how you set it up, it probably wasn't going to fall through if, the Eagles lose that Super Bowl or if something happens.
Sure. Yeah, so we were talking about this earlier before we came on air. When I covered the Eagles-Patriots Super Bowl back in 2018, the Eagles were winning virtually the entirety of that game until the fourth quarter. And so I spent most of that game writing a column about Alshon Jeffrey, their wide receiver, who had guaranteed they were going to win the game, had caught a touchdown pass earlier in the game, and who I had a ton of reporting and information about because I had done a story about him earlier in the year. So I had been to his hometown, I had talked to his old coaches and family members and all these people. So it was great. Like, it was teed up for me to write this column about Alshon Jeffrey. And then the Patriots took the lead. And I was freaking out in the press box of US Bank Stadium in Minneapolis. What am I going to write if they lose this game? Because nobody's going to want to read about Alshon Jeffrey's background and his guarantee if the Patriots win 33-32.
Exactly.
So, fortunately, the Eagles came back, they won the game, and I was able to salvage the column. But I've had situations in the past also where you work on something an entire game, you have to file at the instant the game ends, and in the final 5 minutes of the game, the entire course of the game changes.
Yeah.
Everything you've written goes out the window, and you just got to type for all you're worth.
Yeah.
And there's a deadline as well.
And there's a deadline. You have 5 minutes after the game. You better have something, whether it's coherent or not. You better have something.
Yeah.
It's a saying we have in the business. Sometimes it's better to be done than good, and that's just the way it goes.
Exactly. Yeah.
Exactly.
And going back to that, it's you said it was more of a profile-based story, which I mean, at that point, that's going back to that example. Alshon Jeffrey, he was the prized free agent acquisition, and once the Eagles signed him, we felt like, oh my gosh, we have a receiver now. So that I feel like kind of factored into the story.
Sure, what you're looking for in any event you're covering, whether it's a school board meeting, whether it's a Super Bowl, whether it is a protest, crime story, anything, you're looking for a relevant angle. What do people want or need to know out of this? And what, if I'm a columnist, what can I say that's interesting about it, right? And in that Super Bowl game, Alshon Jeffrey was a compelling figure.
Yeah.
He was somebody who said, we're going to win this freaking game. And I was brought here to win this game. And that made him interesting. Not just to me, but to Eagles fans and to the storyline of that game. So when he catches the touchdown pass in the first quarter, it's like, oh, okay, this is great. Like, I've got a good angle. Now, it turned out there were other really good angles to that game. There was the Philly special. There was Zach Ertz. There was Nick Foles. There was Brandon Graham. There was, all beating Tom Brady and Bill Belichick. All that stuff. It's never just one particular thing, but just so happened because of the deadline constraints that I had that night, Alshon was the one I picked and relied on.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously going to draw people in. It was a Super Bowl. But having, I feel like, a prominent figure, like a prominent person, that's going to get the reader's attention.
Yes.
Like, if you just mention, like, Buccaneers game, Tom Brady, people are going to end up reading that. So.
Yeah, I mean, there are exceptions to that. There are going to be times where you find a story that's so compelling about somebody who's relatively anonymous that you'll report it and write it anyway in the hopes that the nature of the story itself will draw people in. But yeah, you want to write about Kobe Bryant because people are naturally interested in Kobe Bryant because they know who he is. So you do take that into consideration when you're covering at least sports in particular. Now, with respect to the worlds away from sports, it applies to a certain degree. We're going to write about, people are going to cover Joe Biden because he's the president of the United States. People are going to cover Jim Kenney because he's the mayor of Philadelphia. It's not just celebrity, it's the impact that these figures have on people's everyday lives.
Facts, and as it, comes from a pro, who has to do this work day in and day out, and obviously there are a lot of comp students that are watching. Yeah. Is there even really a difference, between you doing it on the level of the Inquirer, than students who do it in a college setting?
You have to build up to that? Or?
No, journalism is journalism. The students who are working on the website here or the student newspaper or the student TV station, you guys are covering what's important to your community. Yeah. Your community happens to be Cabrini University. For the Philadelphia Inquirer, that community is the city of Philadelphia and its surrounding communities. So the principles are exactly the same. You got to make sure you fact check. You've got to make sure you present all sides to a story as fairly and accurately as you can and as thoroughly as you can. But, the only difference is, if I pick up a copy of the student paper here, I'm not going to be as familiar with what is important to you guys as you would be. Yeah. That's natural. I'm not a student here. I don't work here. But that doesn't mean that the actual work that you're doing is any different from the kind of work that I'm doing for the Inquirer.
Yeah, exactly. And then, obviously, as this interview is winding down, and whatnot, I definitely want to, ask you for some last-minute advice to us all,
to aspiring journalists. Like,
all right. Well, I come at this question two ways. Number one, I got into journalism and made my way up the business the old way. I cannot recommend that you guys or men or women, young men or women who want to get into the business, try to do it the way I did it, because I'm not sure that path exists anymore. And I don't know what the path would be now. Maybe it's creating your own website. Maybe it's going to work for a radio station. Maybe it's going to work for a particular website. Maybe it's being a presence on social media. I don't know. I will say this. If you want to be an excellent journalist, you need to do two things. You need to read everything. Read poetry, read politics, read fiction, read nonfiction, anything you can get your hands on. Good, bad, expand your worldview.
Good, bad.
Two, write. Writing is like riding a bicycle. You're only going to learn how to do it the more you do it. And the more you do it, the better you'll get at it. The more you talk to people who can write, you will learn more, soak it all up, and then you're able to kind of do whatever you need to do within the umbrella of journalism.
Well, great.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Mike, thank you for coming here today.
It was my pleasure, guys. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it greatly, yep. And
it was a great time.
Thank you.
We had a lot of fun.
Pleasure to meet you.
And
that will be all.
Be wrapped up for Loquitur Media. Thank you for joining us today. More of this to come, hopefully. And thank you very much. We are out.
Signing out. Yep.